Well, there's a chill in the air at night, which signals the coming of fall. And when the fall arrives, something I do almost every single year is dip beeswax candles. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I first started doing it in high school. I was taught by an actual beekeeper who employed me to use his wax to make candles. There's another video on my channel on how I do this step by step. It's quite extensive, the instructions. So I'm not going to go into that today, but I did think of adding a few tips to anyone that would like to try this at home. It's a fairly simple process. All you need is beeswax, wick, cotton wick, and then a double boiler setup with a container to hold the wax and a container to hold the water. But I've learned some things over the years from doing this in many different situations. One of the main things that I've learned in the last couple of years from attempting to do this in the barn is you shouldn't do this in a cold environment. There have been a few times when I've tried to do this in the barn in late October, November, and the air has been so cold that when I dip the candle into the wax and it comes out into the air and goes onto the drying rack, it's too cold by the time it goes back for its next dip. And what that does, it sort of separates the layers of the wax. It doesn't really affect the burning quality of the candle, but visually at the top of the candle, you see these spirals, these consecutive spirals from where the layers of wax have cooled and then hit the next hot layer of wax. And it's just not as pretty as when the candles are dipped in a way where there's no sort of rippling at the top. This is just sort of an obsessive detail, but it's one of the things that I pay attention to because I've been doing this for so long. I'm always trying to get better at a process. And it really, for me, it takes years. It takes years of doing something over and over again, observing, and then analyzing, and then fixing. And I have to say that one of the things that I kind of am doing when I'm on the bus or the train or the subway or sitting outside a coffee shop with a cup of coffee is I'm always thinking, and my mind often wanders to the things that I need to think about in terms of like working on something, and I use that time mentally to work. And half of these problems are worked out not in the situation when I'm actually doing the thing, but later when I'm analyzing it on my own away from the activity and figuring out how to solve a problem. This is something you can do in your basement. You can do this in the kitchen, but if you get wax on the surfaces, it's a real pain to clean up. So it's better to be done in the basement, in a garage, in a shed. You can do this with kids too. It's a very fun activity to do with kids. The candles at this point are about 3/8 of an inch thick. This is probably the 6th or 7th dip, and when they're done, they will be slightly under an inch thick at the bottom. It's called a taper because it tapers from the thickest part at the bottom, thinner at the top. So as I dip, the level of wax gets lower and lower because the wax from here is going onto the candles. So there comes a point when the wax would be so low that I wouldn't be able to fully immerse my candle. And the way I address that is that while this wax is being warmed, I have a separate container over here with top-up wax. I need my gloves. So I wouldn't add solid wax to this container because that would impede the dipping of the candles while that wax melts. So what I do is I just top up from this container, and I would add solid wax into this little container to melt while I'm dipping. And that's the procedure of constantly topping this up while dipping. I've been doing stuff like this since I was a little kid, and I've never stopped really. All my summers, the 10 summers I spent working at a historic site, Black Creek Pioneer Village, forced me and my fellow employees to sit in these 19th century buildings wearing old clothing and to just do activities away from technology, because a member of the public could walk in at any moment, and we had to portray life in the 1860s. So we were not allowed to have plastic bottles in view of the public, anything plastic, anything really from the 20th century, anything not from 1860 or earlier. So we definitely couldn't have a phone out, and it was kind of before the time of smartphones. And that did something to me. It gave me the ability to be alone with my thoughts, because you couldn't even have a radio on. So there were sometimes hours where I was sitting and spinning wool on a spinning wheel, or where I'd be at the forge blacksmithing, or I'd have a fire going in a brick oven and I would be baking. So many different things. And I was a teenager when that started, and I grew into an adult over those years of working at Pioneer Village. There's a bee in here. That happens if the windows are open. They smell the wax and they come in. They smell that smell of home. But anyways, I bring that up because I watched a very interesting video on YouTube by a Harvard professor. I watched this last week, and it was entitled, "You Need to Be Bored. Here's Why." And it was all stuff that I already assumed and knew, and actually sort of the way that I live my life. But I found it very interesting that a person of authority was speaking so boldly and so clearly about this subject of essentially something that I lament about internally and don't like to say out loud, because così fan tutti, everybody does it. I'm staring at a phone. He talks about the part of the brain that's known as the default mode network, and it's a fancy term for that part of your brain that switches on when you have nothing to do. He says nothing to do, but I actually think that that's incorrect. I think that it happens for me very often in a situation like this. I don't have music on. I don't have any device in here in the barn. I'm not listening to a podcast. I'm not listening to the radio. And I am alone with my thoughts. I do believe that in a situation like this, where I actually am doing something, my default mode network is switched on. And he explains why it's so important for humans to allow themselves to go into that state. It's because in that situation, our mind wanders and our mind starts to actually think about things. And the reason why the default mode network is uncomfortable for most people is because eventually the mind will wander to places that we don't want to think about and we don't like to think about, like our problems in life or the problems with the world that we can't solve. Those incite feelings of anxiety and stress and depression. And it's easier to distract yourself from those thoughts by pulling out a screen and looking at something, anything, because now you can look at something / anything at all times. And I know the irony of this is that I am conveying this to you through a device, so I apologize, but I do feel that activities like this are so beneficial to our mental health, especially if we can engage in them without anything else, with no device around. I do play music in here every now and then, and I love it. I listen to music while I'm doing stuff like this, but I also spend a lot of time in here with no music and just my thoughts. And it was so interesting to hear this Harvard professor talk about, it's a short video, it's 5 minutes. I do recommend it to anyone, everyone. He spoke of a colleague of his that conducted an experiment. They put people in a room for 15 minutes, and it was specifically with the goal of analyzing what happens when people have nothing to do. So it was in an empty room. People had to sit at a table with nothing to do for 15 minutes. And the only thing that was available for them was a little button that they could press that would administer a painful electric shock. So they could either sit there with their thoughts for 15 minutes, or they could press this button to inflict a painful shock. And it was surprising to see that the majority of people pressed the button and gave themselves a shock. If there's anything that I hope you take away from watching me do what I do and what I have been doing for my whole life, it's this. It's not actually dipping candles, it's not marbling paper, it's not dyeing wool with indigo. It's developing the ability to sit with your thoughts, to allow yourself to go to those places that might be uncomfortable, and then to think about those things. This professor talked about the ultimate place that your mind will wander to. It's what has happened since the beginning of time, the whole meaning of life and meaning in your life, and how it's shocking to see now how far away we are, more than ever before in the history of man, from understanding or thinking about meaning in life, because we are able to distract ourselves. I think the beauty of the answer to that question, what is the meaning of life, is that there will never be words, for me at least, to describe, to actually articulate the answer. But there is a feeling. There are feelings. And for me, the beauty in my life is that the answers have come from the simplest places. Oddly enough, the answer to the meaning of life has not come from the moments of seeming highs in my life where I walked a red carpet for a major Hollywood movie, or I saw the book that I wrote on the bookshelf at Barnes & Noble. You know, those were nice moments in my life, but the real highs have come from seeing a certain color going out on the paper when I'm trying to paint the sky with watercolors, or when I'm swimming in the ocean and the water is just such a wonderful temperature and I'm lying on my back and looking up at the sky, or when I'm dipping beeswax candles.